Ramadan is the holiest month of the Islamic calendar. Muslims are required to abstain from food, drink, and sexual intercourse from sunrise to sunset for every single day of the month of Ramadan. Fasting is also one of the 5 pillars of Islam, meaning it is required for all Muslims to do. During the month of Ramadan, Muslims publicly display their devotion to Allah, showing just how much they're willing to sacrifice to earn righteousness. In fact, Muhammad even said that fasting leads to the forgiveness of sins. On the surface, Islamic fasting seems to be a very pious act. However, there are several things to consider. Here's what happens in the average Muslim country during the month of Ramadan. Productivity drops up to 50%. Food bills rise 50 to 100%. Food waste increases. Weight gain, health issues, dehydration. Why are these things happening during the month of fasting? Another thing to consider is the amount of gluttony that takes place during the month of fasting. Muslims rise early in the morning before dawn and have a large meal, and then they gather once again at sunset to have another feast-like meal. Why is all of this excess food consumption happening during the month of fasting? Depending on where the Muslim lives in the world, his or her fast may either be very long or very short. However, how is it fair that someone who fasts for 15 plus hours a day gets the same reward as someone who fasts for 10 hours or less? Perhaps the biggest issue with Islamic fasting can be found in the book of Matthew, chapter 6, starting in verse 1, which says, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven." Jesus says here, do not practice your righteousness before other people just so you can be seen by them. Keep in mind, Ramadan is a very public month of fasting. Again, in chapter 6, starting in verse 16, Jesus says, "And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you." Jesus says when you fast, it should be between you and God alone. No one else should know that you're fasting. It should not be this public display to appear righteous in front of everyone else. Moving on to the book of Joel, chapter 2, starting in verse 12, it says, "Yet even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting, with weeping, and with mourning, and rend your hearts and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and he relents over disaster." God simply wants us to come to him with our fasting, with our tears, with our prayers, with our mourning, with our grief. He just wants us to come back to him, to return to him. He does not want some surface level appearance of righteousness, because we are not righteous. We cannot earn righteousness with our works. The book of Ephesians, chapter 2, starting in verse 8 says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast." If we could earn righteousness with our striving and our works, then it would not be a free gift that only comes from God. The book of Romans, chapter 13, starting in verse 12, says, "The night is far gone, the day is at hand. So then let us cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us walk properly, as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and sensuality, not in quarreling and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires." It all hinges on this. Muslims are not taught that their sinful desires are wrong. Instead, they are taught that they can gratify those sinful desires within the bounds of Islam. For example, a Muslim man cannot commit adultery. However, he can have up to 4 wives. Muslims are not allowed to commit murder. Instead, they are instructed to follow the Quran, chapter number 9, verse 123. And lastly, during Ramadan, Muslims are not allowed to feast in the day. Instead, they should only feast at night, but call it the month of fasting.